A new COVID vaccine for children 5 and under, toddlers, is set to be approved by the FDA. Meanwhile, a consortium of so-called international Catholic media are gathered to battle vaccine disinformation. Here to help us make sense of all of this and more is Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, Father Tad Pacholczyk. Father Tad, thanks for being here. I want to start with this story. The Pfizer and BioNTech vaccines for children under 5 could be available by the end of February if approved by the FDA. Now, this will ultimately be a 3-dose vaccination for children 6 months through 4 years old. What are the bioethical concerns involved here and the scientific concerns when children are at a much, much lower risk of severe illness stemming from COVID?
Well, I think you've really nailed it on the head right there, that the question becomes, do we have a proportionate reason here to start vaccinating infants and very young children? And, you know, is the threat that we're dealing with here of that kind of magnitude? And as we've watched COVID play out over months and now a couple of years, we have a much better handle on exactly what we're confronting. And it seems that there is a wide latitude for judgment there and for debate about the real benefits to be giving this vaccine to such a young audience. There also remains a second consideration, which is connected to long-term effects. We still are in the early phases of using this vaccine widely, and there are some effects from vaccines that arise further down the road. And when you're younger, you have obviously a longer lifespan ahead of you in which some of those effects might be able to be manifested. So that's a concern as well. We need to be very, very careful before we launch into widespread vaccination of this age group.
Yeah, and with schools, both private and public, mandating vaccines for students and faculty, shouldn't the use of such a vaccine, particularly on young children, be left to the discretion of their parents? I mean, ethically speaking, why are we forcing them to do things with their bodies that their parents or they themselves may be uncomfortable with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we as a church always emphasize the importance of case-specific discernments about our healthcare, and that includes vaccines and vaccinations. We have to judge them on an individual basis, depending on our particular circumstances, and, you know, our other comorbidities and other features like that. So this is one of the problems with broad mandates that don't allow for adequate exemptions, that you are sort of saying, hey, one size fits all here. And that's never true in medicine. Every individual's body will react differently to different exposures, and it's important to factor that in as part of intelligent healthcare decision-making.
Father Tad, one of the vexing things in all of this public debate and the ethical debate over these mandates is the Vatican. I mean, the Vatican and Pope Francis himself have endorsed the use of mandates, even going so far as to suggesting that it's a moral duty to take the vaccine. Is it fair or moral to make vaccination a condition for life and work and to exist in society, given the current state of this pandemic and the effectiveness of these vaccines, scientifically speaking?
Well, I think you're right to point out that there is a lot of uncertainty still regarding the performance of the vaccines. And this is partly because we have new variants like Omicron popping up. We don't know that this always works with the kind of direct effect that sometimes is claimed. In other words, one of the claims you hear a lot is that the elderly will be able to be always protected, and that anybody who gets the vaccine will have the advantage of avoiding hospitalization. But if you look in Israel right now, they keep very good statistics there. They have about 1,000 people currently facing serious COVID, and they're hospitalized. And of those, about 500 are fully vaccinated, and another 100 are partially vaccinated. So it shows you that this is not a silver bullet. I think that we have gone about our decision making as if the vaccine were a silver bullet. And if it were, then it might make sense to become a kind of cheerleader, if you will, for the vaccine. But I think, we as church cannot do that. We cannot be cheerleaders for a specific vaccine. What we need to be cheerleading for is for careful decision making by all people, and especially by Catholics, that we have a duty of good stewardship to take care of our health. God expects that of us, and that is where our responsibility, where the rubber meets the road, if you will.
That's a good segue to a recent report by Ed Penton, the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register, Father. He reported that Pope Francis met privately twice with the CEO of Pfizer. Now, precise details about the meeting are not known. Pfizer will neither confirm nor deny the meetings. But Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, recently said any Vatican employee who requests a religious exemption due to the vaccine's association with abortion were unjustified. He cited Pfizer's vax specifically as not having used fetal cells in its production. Now, Father, doesn't this seem ethically problematic for Vatican officials to issue these sweeping statements and basically dismiss religious exemptions after meeting with the Pfizer CEO?
Well, it is important that conscience exemptions be made available. The Church has always emphasized the importance of respecting conscience. And so here the issue is that there is this association, a distant association with cell lines derived from abortions, but the Church has been quite clear that this does not make it illicit to get vaccinated. In other words, one can freely do that. But there still may be some individuals who in conscience say, this is something I don't want to do. And there should be a mechanism in the face of mandates to allow for appropriate conscience exemptions to be obtained. That we need to have a wide latitude for those conscience protections to be in place. And we as church should especially be modeling how that is best to be done.
Father, in late January, Pope Francis made a statement. I want to get your reaction to this. He condemned spreading what he called disinformation and fake news regarding COVID-19 and vaccines. He said, quote, "To be properly informed, to be helped to understand situations based on scientific data and not fake news is a human right. Correct information must be ensured, above all, to those who are less equipped, to the weakest, and to those who are most vulnerable." Now, the Pope was speaking before a group of international Catholic media organizations who banded together to form CatholicFactChecking.com. Now, we're talking about groups like Our Sunday Visitor and Alatia and others. Just so everyone understands, this consortium is funded by Google and organizations associated with the Gates Foundation and Soros-backed groups. So they are not impartial here. First, your thoughts on the Pope's comments, and then your thoughts on this consortium. Who decides what's fake news or real information or real scientific data, frankly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the question. Who decides what is fake news? I mean, Raymond, just think back for a little bit. You know, we were at one point, if somebody were to say something like this, that vaccines fail to stop COVID transmission from person to person, then that would have been declared, oh, fake news. That's fake news.
Right,
no,
you'd have
it's
a warning.
Not. It turns out, exactly, the vaccines don't actually do that. Or if you were to say COVID vaccines may have some bad side effects. Oh, that's fake news, everybody says. Well, we don't know that yet. We've only had the vaccines for, a little over a year in widespread use, and there are other instances where there have been bad effects. For example, the influenza vaccine back in 1976. You may remember it was given to more than 40 million people, and it ended up being linked to at least 500 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is that weird syndrome where you have damaged nerves and muscles. So, to be able to, but again, that would be considered fake news if you say there could be any bad effects from getting vaccinated. So the list kind of goes on. You could say, for example, if you were to come out and say that continual booster shots will be needed, Well, in the past, they would say, oh, no, 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 you won't need any boosters. And now you look at Israel, they are on their fourth shot, and there's no end to boostering in sight. So who's
Well,
going to
and
determine what is fake
well,
news?
and science evolves. Science is evolving. We keep making discoveries. And what we've discovered is clotting is a result of some of these vaccines, not all of them, but some of them, myocarditis in young men. And we're not talking about 4 or 5 cases. We're talking thousands of cases of this. So all of that has to be taken into consideration. And the repeated boosters, there was that British study that the repeated boosters destroy your natural immunity. All of that has to be looked at, studied, considered. But to simply say this is misinformation, who are you to declare that? I'm sorry. And frankly, this Catholic fact-checking site, when you read it, one quickly realizes its goal is to disparage religious exemptions and poo-poo natural immunity. Now, isn't that itself disinformation, Father?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think here the problem of labeling others as disseminators of fake news or as anti-vaxxers. I think it is important to say the church is definitely not an anti-vax institution, but it's also not a gung-ho, every single vaccine everywhere needs to be gotten institution. The church walks a middle line, and all of us as Catholics should do that and maintain that sense of balance. Because otherwise, Raymond, what do we end up doing? We end up polarizing the environment around us, the anti-vaxxers against the pro people, and nobody's willing to grant that there may be some truth on both sides that needs to be looked at, discussed honestly and openly, and allow the science to work out the details here.
And there's legitimate scientific disagreement on this. I mean, look, there's a reason. I hate to be the bearer of uncomfortable news, but there's a reason that several FDA officials resigned because they were concerned about allowing vaccines in a certain young population. They didn't see the necessity or the reason for that, given the outcomes if they got COVID. So when you have professionals who've been doing this for decades, worried about that sort of action, and there's a political motivation, that's our responsibility as journalists and scientists to ask those hard questions and be willing to be fully transparent with the public, because it's ultimately their health and they have to make those decisions in a free society. Now, the Pope went on to cite what he called an infodemic, which he described as a distortion of reality based on fear, falsified or invented news, and, quote, allegedly scientific information. Now, Father, this whole COVID narrative has been based on fear. I mean, look at the lockdowns and that new Johns Hopkins report that said there was no benefit of having those lockdowns. Is there a danger in trying to turn evolving science into dogma? And that's, to my eye, what seems to be happening here.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's a fair criticism of some of what has been going on around us. It's imperative to recognize that you have to take some of the scientific declarations with a grain of salt, sometimes a very large grain of salt, because it is evolving and the details are changing. What I think is really bad is when you have scientists, in a sense, being themselves excluded from the discourse. And we've seen some of that. You mentioned some of that going on in government agencies, but also in other venues in the media as well. I'm thinking of the scientist Robert Malone, who is an mRNA inventor who has had a lot of difficulty recently, in the press, in the media. So there's sort of a kind of propaganda that is taking a foothold and saying certain people will be allowed to participate and others not, rather than the free exercise of science by those who indeed are qualified as scientists and are stakeholders, to be able to really discuss the pros and the cons all the way through. So I think turning this over to consortia like we're discussing risks skewing that process and preventing it from getting really the truth out to us as quickly as possible, because that really needs to be the goal in the midst of a pandemic.
Well, and with all due respect to the people in the Vatican and these Catholic journalists, look, I know a lot of these people. I've been to these conventions. These are my peers. I've sat at press conferences with them. Frankly, they don't know. Are we saying that Vatican bureaucrats and Catholic journalists know more than the guy who created the mRNA vaccine and epidemiologists and disease specialists at Yale and Harvard and Stanford? Is that what they're really saying? Because that sounds like what they're saying, that they're going to Catholic fact-check people. We need a Catholic fact-checkers for the fact-checkers now, Father. This story just sent my blood pressure through the roof because I hate the idea of dilettantes setting themselves up as somehow experts, and they want to lord over and control information flow. Nobody's allowed to do that in a free society. Do that somewhere else. Do that in China.
Yeah, I think that's a real concern that we're up against now, as in a sense, information flow is controlled by a very small number of power brokers like Facebook, Instagram, and Google. So this is something that is a very, very broad concern. We have to be watching this into the future. We've seen it play out specifically with respect to COVID vaccinations, but I think this has broader implications for us to keep an eye and to be sure that we have appropriate antitrust kinds of initiatives to be sure that the power is not too concentrated in just one or two places. As the old saying about power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, it's human nature, Raymond. It's just human nature.
Yeah, well, this also feels like government and corporate interests trying to rein in independent media sources. And now they've gotten so granular, they're trying to control and censor Catholic free media. That can't be allowed, and the people should push back hard against it. You can read Father Tad's commentary and learn more about the ethical profiles of the COVID vaccines on the National Catholic Bioethics Center website, ncbcenter.org. Thank you, Father Tad.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you, Raymond.